Okay, well, I've got a lot of questions here. Let's see how many I can get through. Yes, so I'll just get stuck in. So I've numbered the groups. So this is December's group. So could you clarify the relationship between self and the indestructible heart essence? And can they both be described as singular, independent, and what should we call everyday self? So there's loads of questions in there, so that's good. So yes, there's a danger, isn't there, that we're going to start talking about, is this the self, or is that the self, or is there a self? Like, what is the self? We're going to start asking questions like that, aren't we? And what I want you to do is to try and notice when those questions come up and apply them to your own experience of how you yourself use the term self. When I say myself, what do I mean? Do I mean the indestructible heart essence? Do I mean my heart wish? Or do I mean openness, clarity, sensitivity? Or do I mean that little me that I'm trying to protect all the time? The me that's trying to hide, the me that's kind of traumatized, the me that... Am I talking about that? Is that what I think is me? Doesn't matter, because it's all important and all interesting. So it really doesn't matter what we call self and what we don't call self. What matters is, as Dashi was saying this morning, what needs liberating and what isn't liberation. What feels trapped and stuck and not in line with your heart wish, you could say. It's not what I want. So there's an I in there that's not wanting something, and that's something that we don't want might actually be what we call ourself. Why do people commit suicide other than because the part of themselves that really wants freedom is also thinking that itself is the thing that it's going to kill. So it's done something very clever with this whole sense of self. One sense of self has got the right impulse to be free, but that's covered over with another sense of self which is thinking, oh, and this is what I need to be free of, I'll kill it, which is also what they're thinking of themselves. They want to kill themselves, if one wants to do that. So it's very important to look at how you're using the word. It's not something you've got to believe in. You may decide you're not going to use the word self for the indestructible heart essence because whatever reason, how you use the word self. So so it's not really a theoretical thing that you have to understand the relationship, but this might be a different kind of question to that. Anyway, the question goes on to saying, can the self, or the indestructible heart essence, whatever you call it, be described as singular, independent, and what should we call our everyday self? So you've got to decide what you're looking at. Are you looking at your little self that you're hanging on to and defending and clinging to and frightened of losing and all those other kind of negative emotions, or you don't like, or you want to be like this, or you want it to be like that? Are you talking about that? And is that a whole complex of things, or is it just one reality? So you look and see. And are those elements that make it up, are they permanent or impermanent? Are they changing? Are they something that you could identify with? And if they're not, then you're obviously talking about skandhas, aren't you? So the self, when you try to kill yourself, you're usually you're identifying with the skandhas. You're identifying with those parts of yourself which are made up of all sorts of things. And some of those things you don't like. In fact, you intensely don't like. But they're still you, disliking them. So they are constructed from various elements that you think you could dispense with. They're not me. They're something else. But actually, I would call them myself. I don't like myself. So you have to decide which one you're looking at. Is that one singular in the sense of it can't be divided or broken down anymore? Like when we talk about a single point, the point about a point is it can't be broken down anymore. If it can be broken down anymore, it's more than one point, isn't it? And it's actually a collection of points. So can you find a single point, and it has no dimensions, so how could you find it? It can't be small, can it? Because something small has dimensions that are small, but it doesn't have dimensions. So in the same way, you look for yourself. You're not saying there's no such things as points, but you're not saying there's no such thing as self. But when you look for yourself, you don't find anything that you can actually, or maybe you do. If you do, have a look and see, is that something that's compounded and constructed? Can it be broken into parts? Is it a skandha? Is it just the skandhas? Okay, or is it something that goes beyond all that? It can't be grasped in that way. You can't grasp it as either singular or you can't grasp. If you said it was made up of parts, that's not true. If you said it was one thing, there's another problem. There's problems with that as well. But on the other hand, if it can't be divided, then you've got no proof that it's the skandhas. So it could be something other than the skandhas, couldn't it? It must be something other than the skandhas. So it's really something to keep coming back to and looking, how do you use the word singular? What do you understand by the word singular? And these are examinations to undertake in meditation rather than conceptualizing. You're not, even in meditation, you're not trying to come up with a right answer. You're trying to home in on and look at what am I actually experiencing? When I experience myself, my most innermost essence of my being, what I truly am, is it something that I can grasp? Is it something that I can see from outside of it? Is it something that I can actually pin down as saying this is, it's made of atoms, or it's made of cells, or it's made of thoughts, or it's made of this, or it's made of that? Can I actually say any of that? And if you can't, are you actually convinced of that? And is that how you actually live your life? Or do you live your life as if you're this little me, even though when you look, you don't find anything like that? So looking for those inconsistencies and looking at what your choices are, could you actually just relax that tendency to think I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm my body, most of the time we think we're a body, don't we? Sort of, if I die, I think it's my body. My body will die, and then I will die. I will be dead when my body's dead. So I sort of think I'm my body. But then when you look more deeply, that can't be the case, because your body's changing all the time. Which body? Am I my body when I was a baby, or am I my body when I'm old, or in between? And I always think this when you get these religions where they say, your body is resurrected and you come back, and I think, do I come back as an old decrepit woman? Do I come back as a baby? What body are we talking about? So when you start thinking like that, your whole idea of what you mean by body starts to change. So you don't just think, oh, I'm not my body, okay, what next? You think, So what the hell am I talking about when I talk about my body? It has some reality, and that we're not saying, there's no body, so don't even look. It just says, look carefully. What could it possibly mean? And that examination goes deeper and deeper. So you need to look at singular, what that means to you, whether that matters to you. And then independent. Independent means it's not dependent. It's not dependently arising. If it's your indestructible heart essence, it's not dependently arising. It's not depending on your seeing it for it to be there. It is there. It's not dependent on anything. You can't say, well, an object of consciousness depends on a consciousness knowing it. But when I talk about myself, does that depend on anything? And you'll find some parts of what you call yourself do depend on something. And then there's this sort of open-ended examination of ultimately, if I don't grasp onto this or that, or try to step outside of it and see it from, having split it off, seeing it from outside, if I just relax completely and don't have any of these, don't follow and believe in any of these thoughts, it's this or that, what is the experience of that? Is that closer to reality? And notice what's the experience as you get closer to that very simple, non-contrived way of being with yourself, as it were. How does that feel like going in the direction of liberation, independence? Does it have a power from its own side? So it's each of these words is pointing to a journey, really. So then the question ends with, what should we call our everyday self? So again, what do you call, what in your everyday life, like when you're offended and upset about something, what self do you mean? You're the one who's upset, so you should know. What is that? You might look and think, actually, as soon as I look closely at it, it kind of dissolves and I feel better about everything. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I feel better about everything. I'm still saying I, but this is an I that isn't a problem. So you're using the same word, because you're not saying there is an I, or there isn't an I. You're just saying, you're describing an experience of what's real and what's true when you're honest. And even the Buddha used the word I. He didn't have any problem with using the word I, but he never would have said there is an I or there isn't an I. Because that's a different kind of thinking, isn't it? You can almost feel it. There is an I. You can sort of feel a sort of rigidness and complication coming in. Or you just say, I'm happy. There's nothing complicated about that, is there? Doesn't matter. In fact, it's quite good, isn't it? I'm happy. I feel quite integrated when I say that. I'm happy. I don't ask myself, But then if I'm happy because I've got to, if I have this, I'm happy, and if I don't have it, I'm not happy. What sort of I am I talking about there? I don't have it, so I'm not happy. I've got to have it. I've got to have it. So it's very complicated, isn't it? I have got to have it. What sort of it, and what sort of it is going to actually meet that sense of being happy? There's so much to examine there. So it's not a matter of, have I got it right? Am I using the words right? That's what I'm trying to avoid happening. It's just like when you use these words, do you yourself know what you mean? And you'll probably find, well, I'd be very surprised if you didn't find, you meant two seemingly completely opposite things. Like when I'm angry, or angry with myself, or one thing, and then when I'm really standing for my values and my principles, and I'm taking a vow, and I'm deciding to follow the path to awakening, I'm taking refuge, I in a completely different way. So notice that. Just notice, oh, hang on, I am using it in two different ways. And one way is suffering, and one way is liberation. I'm just talking like that all the time. Or maybe you're not. I am, certainly. So with all the discussion about self and not self, there seems to be a temptation to want to get rid of everyday self. So that's showing how this person who's written this question is using self, isn't it? Everyday self. They don't mean by everyday self that joyful, liberated presence that's spontaneously manifesting the Buddha nature. They actually mean this self that gets everything wrong and feels frightened and even can turn on itself. That's what I call my everyday self. So should I call that myself or not? It's certainly made up of the skandhas, isn't it? It's made up of various things, that self. It's made up of, me and my ideas about my body, me and my ideas about my feelings, me and my ideas about perception and the different habits of mind and personality traits. It's me and me watching me. It's made up of all sorts of bits. So that tells you it's skandhas. So then you can think of the Buddha's teaching about the skandhas, the self. The skandhas are not the self. So, I think I'm beginning to realize what that means. I'm beginning to realize that these skandhas that I keep identifying with actually are not myself. They're impermanent, they're made of bits, they're kind of constructed. In fact, my own mind is constructing them. It's constructing an idea of myself. And this isn't myself. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? So just look and see whether you can distinguish those two ways of talking about self, or talking about yourself, or your being, or the essence of your being, or who you truly are. It doesn't matter which phrase you use, really. But yes, we do have this temptation to want to get rid of that self that's such a nuisance, the skandha self. We do want to get rid of the skandha self because it is attached to things that are not going to bring any satisfaction in the end. And you could almost say that the self, I think Dasha said it this morning even, that the self that's attached to the self is actually part and parcel of the skandhas. It's in a sense, it's not the self, because it can't be, because it's impermanent and changing and composite and all the rest of it. But you need to come back to that and look at it again and again for yourself until it becomes something that you're saying, not something that you're saying because that's what you're supposed to say, or it's what you're supposed to find, but it is what you have found. And if you haven't, you come back and you complain and you say, look, I've looked and I don't find it's like what you said. Okay, let's have a discussion about it. Okay, let's go on to Jayasiddhi's group, which was two main questions. Oh yes, this is interesting. In the homage to the three jewels, all three sections talk about peace. It is peace. Could you please say more about peace in this context? Yes, I think it's very important to say something about peace in the Buddhist context. Because it is a very ordinary word in a way. We use that. We have an intuitive sense of what peace would be. But I think it's always used in a very technical sense in the Buddhist tradition. I mean, it's used in that natural sense, but it's used to refer to something technical, which is the end of suffering. The Buddha, this was just Dashi said this morning, this is what the Buddha taught. Suffering and the end of suffering, the cessation of suffering, which is peace. And if it's peace, it means it's nishprapancha. For those who've done THB will know what nishprapancha means. It means it's not never can find a good word for prapancha, but it's like it's not constructed at all. It's not constructed, it's not made up of anything, it's not made up of thought, of parts, but it's also not constructed by thinking either. You can't think it. Okay, you can refer to it with words, and you can think of it in the sense of, I'm going to think about peace, I'm going to think about nirvana, but it's actually something that we only know directly. We can't know it through the words. It's like the word peace is a finger pointing to the moon. If you look at the finger, you won't see the moon. If you look at peace as if it's something that you can, if you look at it as something that's pointing to it, you won't see it. You have to make a personal leap into what that would be if there were no more of that process which you can feel so strongly in meditation. You can feel that insight comes for a moment, and then immediately it's deadened by some sort of mental effort to make it into something. And that's what creates or keeps us stuck in Mara's mandala, or the ego mandala, or whatever you want to call it. So it's very fundamental, and peace is to be not caught up in that anymore. So it's the same as freedom. The later tradition does talk about two kinds of nirvana, but that developed out of the ding-dong between the various commentarial traditions. And even in the later tradition, often they refer to nirvana as the same as Buddha. So it means Buddha, really, peace. It's peace. But because it is nishprapancha, there's no more of that deluded skandha activity going on, grasping the skandhas. So I'm glad you asked that question, because it's really important. So it comes up, isn't it? Who is peace beginningless? So that nature that is beyond all prapancha has no beginning, has no end. And then there's the Dharma is peace. And there's a question that comes up later about when the Buddha said, take refuge in the Dharma, or I take refuge in the self, or take refuge in the self, equating self and Dharma. The Dharma in that context is referring to the Dharma as in the praise to the three jewels, which is the truth of cessation and the truth of the path. The first part of that verse is truth of cessation, non-existent, not non-existent, not existed, so on. And then the second, and that is peace beyond prapancha. It's known within itself. That's what it comes in together, the self, nishprapancha, peace. And then the path is the second part of the verse, where it's the light within us that dispels the darkness of wrong views. Is it wrong views in that verse? No, of attachment to the senses. It actually, there's a mistake in my translation. It should be attachment, aversion, and confusion, all three. But for some reason, I just missed it out. I'm sorry. It happens sometimes. You're focusing on one bit of the translation and you just miss another bit. So, and then the last verse, they see the phenomenal world is not self. So the world that Dashji was talking about this morning, the world that is the skandhas, that's Mara's world, is seen to be not self, which is peace. Again, equating nishprapancha, peace, not self, and Dharma, and what the Buddha realizes. So when you can see those connections, I think it perhaps removes quite a lot of questions that arise if you haven't quite picked that up. Okay, so in the meditation instructions, we're told to see the watcher as also being thinking. And how do we spot the difference between the watcher and the true self? So I think I've more or less dealt with that, haven't I? That if you're sort of stepping back from your experience to kind of put it in a category of, oh, this is right, or this is this, or this is that, you've already kind of made it complicated, haven't you? So that's okay. You don't need to think, oh, I've got to destroy all that, it's wrong. You just have to notice, oh, that's the skandhas. Again, I mean, I've said it as if you're saying it in a labeling way, but you could say, to start with, you might say it's skandhas or it's thinking. In some ways, that's what, when you label it as thinking, you're basically saying it's the skandhas. And then as you get used to that, you can start to look more carefully from that point of view that's not the skandhas, that can't grasp the skandhas. Nonetheless, it's totally amazing that anything's appearing at all. I mean, how could it even look as if there was something there? How could there be any sense that there is a storyline or continuity or a person or anything? How can any of it appear if it's not the skandhas? And then you go back and you look again, but it certainly isn't the skandhas. So then this is when people say they feel confused. It's actually a very good sign, because it means they're starting to drop assumptions and recognizing the normal skandha way of thinking, grasping the sangha way of thinking, is not actually working. You keep thinking it works, and then you try it again, and that's the spiral learning. You've tried it again, and it still hasn't worked. So you try it again, and it hasn't worked. And then you try it another way, and it still hasn't worked. You always run into these problems. You could say philosophical problems, but you could also say meditation problems, because you're not getting that sense of freedom that arises from when you let go of punching, you get go of that grasping mind. You're not getting that sense of freedom. If you're not getting that sense of freedom, it's because you've come back, you've grasped again in another way. You've found another way to sort of grasp, which is endless. But nonetheless, every time you do that in your meditation, you are weakening the hold of that mandala of avidya. So, don't need to get impatient with yourself. You just feel pleased that at least you are doing that. You are at least undermining. And I love this word, conceit. You're undermining that conceit that you know. I know the skandhas are myself. I know I am my skandhas. It's a conceit. You don't know that. If you look more carefully, you don't know that. In fact, it doesn't make any sense. And then you feel you don't know anything. So that's actually humbling, dropping some conceit, isn't it? Allowing something else to come through. And we could have a whole long discussion about what might come through. But so yes, that's a very important question to keep coming back to. And you keep finding yourself slipping back into, oh yes, that's the skandhas, and this is my true self. Well, you've done it again, haven't you? You've turned it into something that you think you know. So that's good that you've done that, because then you're getting subtler. You're noticing more subtle ways that you're grasping, and beginning to realize that the subtle grasping is your worst enemy. All the grosser grasping is based on the most subtle grasping. So if you can catch, even for a fraction of a second, the subtle grasping and start to undermine it, all the rest is undermined in the instant. Even if it's only seems like, hardly any time at all, or any time at all. Nonetheless, this is like cutting the tree at the root. It's not snipping the branches, it's cutting the root, it's weakening the whole edifice. So even though you might have only a few moments of that from time to time, really rejoice that it's happening at all. And it only happens in that circumstance that you've created by staying with it long enough for that to kind of start to break through. So really feel, encouraged. Yes, it's worth sitting and staying with this shamatha vipassana stuff is worthwhile, because you do get those moments where, and you don't get them any other way really. And also you get the opportunity to appreciate those moments and to recognize this is the path. So I want to encourage you with that. So we could talk about that forever, but anyway, let's move on to Dorje's group. Can you comment on the relationship between our connectedness and distinctiveness? That could go in many directions, that question. What does inseparable but distinct mean? So this is something that I do often talk about in terms of our individual manifestation, and also in terms of the different qualities, the different Buddha qualities. And then we're moving into very deep territory there, which probably we haven't got time to go into today. But I'm assuming, because it's sort of using the kind of language I use, it's talking on that deep level, our connectedness and our heart connection with each other. And it's moving into the territory of the jnana of self and jnana of other that Rigzin Shikpo talks about. 3 spheres and that kind of thing, and the interpenetration. So all these kind of teachings are based on having already made this distinction between the self is not the skandhas. So I haven't gone that far, even though in a way, when Trungpa Rinpoche talks about the mandala of samsara and the mandala of nirvana, he is kind of moving into that level of teaching, very, very advanced level of teaching, and linking into the fact that we intuitively can pick up on those very deep teachings from the very beginning. And sometimes that's what draws us into the long haul, because we're inspired by those deeper teachings. But yes, it's a very profound question, isn't it? Like, if we see the skandhas are impermanent and they're not, they're made up of parts and they're impermanent, and therefore they can't be self. They can't. They're a construction of, perhaps you could say they're mental construction imposed on our experience, perhaps you could say. But then when you look at what is our experience, you can't say it is all broken up like that, because we experience wholes. When I say wholes, I mean with the W in front. We experience wholes, not. And this is the big mystery in science as well, in the maths and physics. How can you have? We can understand all these little processes that go on in the atomic level, but how do you get wholes? How do you get a life out of that? How does it stick together? It's not made of parts, but how does it stick together? How's that even possible? And this is really going beyond, I suppose, what the Buddha's really talking about most of the time. He leaves that as an open-ended question, and he just concentrates on whatever it is, it isn't the skandhas. which we really need to have that drummed in. You know, whatever it isn't the skandhas. Look at the skandhas and see. Whatever's real can't be the skandhas, because the skandhas don't hang together. It really needs to be drummed in, doesn't it? So then, if we can get beyond that point and we can start connect to our intuition that there are wholes with W's, you know, that there's a whole being there. It's not just a load of bits, impermanent bits that are going to fall apart any minute. There's a real beings there. There's a real Buddha. There's a real, you know, there's within myself this potential to be a Buddha in a Buddha world with Buddha realm, compassionate for all beings who are equally real and equally Buddhas. If any of that's going to be true, it's going to be at a point where we won't be able to grasp it. We know it, and then it's, you know, then you've got to try to kind of find words to talk about something that you can only point to. But right from the beginning, we feel that sense of meaning with connectedness. Our connection with others is what makes us what we are, isn't it? We wouldn't. That connection has to be part of that whole, if you like. Or it has to be as intrinsic to that wholeness of things. And then at the same time, even though we can't think it, how do you get distinct manifestations emerging from that? They do. This is why, you know, Rinpoche goes around saying, you know, what's it? Emma comes from Koricha Mishi now and Osache. What is it in English? The phenomena of the three realms of samsara, they're appearing. What is it?
While not existing, they appear. While not existing.
While not existing, they appear. How incredibly amazing! He would wander around. He'd say it all day long. Every time he did something, or he saw somebody appearing, and they're not there. How amazing! And that sense of, and he used this word a lot, samjimichaba, can't be encompassed by thinking, and yet it's real. I can't think it, but it's real. Samjimichaba, can't. We tend to say it's inconceivable, and I always think inconceivable is rather weak in English, because it just means, I can't conceive it. But samjimichaba is like, it's so amazing that it's like, it can't be held by thought. It's kind of burst out. This is a reality that's burst in on us somehow. So yes. So what does inseparable but distinct mean? Well, again, when you look into your experience, is that what you experience when you let go of grasping at the skandhas? Is that what you experience? Look and see. And then you go, Maho. Maho. How wonderful. So anyway, I think we'll have to stop there. And Namta's group was, what is it that is experiencing, and what is experiencing? Yes, that's right. Keep looking. When we say that, you know, like, okay, I was talking about the mandala of our experience. It's the mandala of, there's a sense of, I'm seeing the world, or experiencing the world, or my world, from a particular point which doesn't have any dimensions, so it's not small and it's not anywhere, but nonetheless point seems to capture what I mean, and it emanates out, but it doesn't separate out, which I kind of know what I mean, and it kind of, there's a kind of, this is my experience and then it's not your experience. So we could talk about that, but there's kind of, there does seem to be others, and it does seem to be that connection with others, especially when we, in our heart, we don't feel they're separate, but I'm not them and they're not me. So that's like really a lovely feeling, lovely, very alive. If you experience that, it feels, wow, that's the direction I want to go. It goes in the direction of freedom and joy. But then, what is any of that? And then, why would you ask, and who is asking what that is? Why would you ask what that was? It's really interesting. It's a very subtle movement within it. Within your experience, a subtle movement of wanting to kind of, it's that grasping again, isn't it? It wants to just step out and have it as something slightly separate that I can look at. Whereas actually that's an extra movement over and above the simplicity of the experience itself. You're just subtly complicating it. That's the prapancha of it, isn't it? Before you prapunched, as it were, it was all quite, you were just experienced. And you're having to put it into an English sentence, you were experiencing it, but it was experiencing it within itself, happily doing it. And then you kind of, oh, who's experienced what? Ah, so how did that happen? What's happening when that happens? What is that? And then you can start to play on that edge between the two mandalas. Start to get very familiar with the play between the two. And the more familiar and playful you get between the two, the less there's any sense of problem, actually. So keep coming back there and start to learn to enjoy it. That's my advice. How do we understand our relationship with our body as a tool to knowing our true self or Buddha nature? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because when you think of the body as the skandhas that can be broken up into parts which can be separated from, and this was very prevalent at the time of the Buddha. There was the idea that you could separate yourself from the body because the body was what was holding you down. It was impermanent and suffering. You could actually detach yourself from the body and gain liberation. And the Buddha really tried that. He tried very hard with that one. That was the point of his asceticism. And he just nearly killed himself. And kind of, luckily, he saw the light before he did kill himself. I say luckily, I mean, it was our good fortune that he was at the stage where he saw that was not the right way in time. So that anything that we do that separates ourselves off from our body is going to involve us in more suffering. And that's why it means anything at all to use the body as a tool or as a vehicle for deepening our understanding of the nature of reality. But it's not the skandha body that we're talking about. But then, is what we take to be ourselves, what we take to be the skandhas, are there ever any skandhas there in the first place, really? I mean, we think we've constructed the body out of all these, the body's constructed all these things, and that's my body, and I'm experiencing that body. But then when you look again, it's all highly dubious. Even your idea of your body, and its inside and outside and the environment all being separate, it's all dubious. It's, however, whichever, and you need to do this over and over again. You need to look again and again and again. How am I constructing my idea of my body? And how much of that is true? And how much of that can I actually let go of? And when you do that, normally you don't find you disappear. Although great yogins are known to disappear. They actually discover their true nature of their body, and they can choose to just not manifest it anymore. I don't know what they do. And then they can decide to come back and re-manifest it. So it's much more fluid than we think. What we mean by body, rainbow body, illusory body, and the skandha body which we're making into this clunky thing. We're doing that with our thinking, with our misperception of what our body really is. So I think it's especially good for people like ourselves in the West these days who are kind of quite broken up into head and quite impatient with the body and the limitations of the body, trying to kind of be something or be sort of, we're disintegrated, we're not an integrated whole. It's quite useful to ground yourself and integrate yourself into a whole, but then not to get to the point where you now become attached to the body. So you could be doing body awareness things that were actually helping you to recognize what was the skandha and what was not true self and what was impermanent and what not to be attached to. You can be doing that at the same time as becoming more aware of the integrated whole of how, you could say internal or external or so on, and not really separate. You can become aware of that, and that would not be attaching to the body. Or you could actually get to the point where you think, oh, I like working with the body, I don't want to, forget the mind thing, I like the body thing. You sometimes get the idea that people think that that's kind of easier. Well, it's easier in terms of being attached to the skandhas, but it's not easier in terms of recognizing your true nature. So all these things depend on your level of renunciation in the way that Dashi was talking about this morning. If you really are determined to detach yourself from the skandhas, then you can use the body as a way of recognizing how you are attached to the skandhas, and then using the body as a way of your awareness and the body not being separate, as a way of recognizing what's not the skandhas, which you can't conceptualize and you can't grasp. And it isn't me, it isn't mine. But it is. It's an expression of that true nature. So there's all sorts of things you can do with the body. So we could talk about that for ages, but we'll move on quickly. Am I doing quite well? Yeah, okay, 5, Patty's group. Could the reflections on self and not self be compared to Mahamudra investigations looking at the arising, dwelling and ceasing? Are they, of sorts I suppose, are they different, or would you see them as the same investigations? I'd say they were the same sort of thing. I think on Dashi's diagram this morning, he kind of indicates that when you're seeing reality as it is, you go in the direction of seeing then what's happening when you're not seeing how it is. That's that whole Mara mandala. Or you go the other way and you're seeing how it is, and it's leading to liberation. The different qualities of the past start to arise, and they're the same sort of process. You're looking, as he said this morning, you're looking for arising, you're looking for dwelling, you're looking for ceasing, and the instruction is given like that, and then you go away and you try to find it. And if you come back and say, yes, I can see thoughts arising, staying and disappearing, well, if somebody comes and tells me that, I know they're not looking properly. But if they come in and say, well, they don't arise and cease, and they say it in that offhand way, I also know they're not looking properly, because it's very, very shocking when you see it. It's very shocking. So if there's no sense of something like something stopped you in your tracks somehow, then you need to look more. To look more carefully, and maybe coming back again and again to check out what's going on. What am I missing? What's going on? And sometimes it takes a long time to get started. But once you get started, it then can go quite quickly. But if you never get started, it certainly won't go quickly. So it's worth keep coming back and trying again. What is it that I'm doing that's making this kind of boring? What is it that I'm doing that's kind of making this seem so obvious? I'm thinking, so what? And it's always something that we're doing. It's always that subtle clinging, subtle grasping that's making things seem like not very interesting. So yes, that's dealt with quite quickly. So 6, Maybar's group. Is the self separate to our spacious awareness? Sometimes it feels one and the same, and other times it feels like the self is watching and experiencing awareness. I think I've more or less answered that in a way, haven't I? So in the instructions, we keep talking about spacious awareness, don't we? And I think for a lot of people, that eludes them. I think it's a nice idea, but it is just an idea. And it's an idea because we're not really recognizing it's our nature. So yeah, we haven't recognized that actually, you could say that a point has no dimensions. We still think I'm going to see this spaciousness as if I could be small and I had dimensions and there's a bigger space beyond me, rather than recognizing, oh, I don't have dimensions, so I am that space. And that's not something that's another idea. It's something that dawns on us. We've heard that so many times, and yet it's as if we never heard it. So don't be surprised if you're still wondering about that. And yes, so sometimes you feel the same, especially if you step outside and it's a nice big sky, open scenery. You sort of feel, oh yeah, that's I can really identify with that space. But then as soon as you sort of find yourself in a corner, it's like that's suddenly inaccessible. Like I'm caught up in my problem, whatever it is, and it's like, how do you get, even if I think of space, it doesn't change anything because there's this solidness in the middle of it all. And then if you go out in the open, and then there's all this space, but even then, it's kind of not everything. It's not completely. There's a boundary somewhere. It's sort of, if there were no boundary anywhere, that would be what you were. That would be openness. That would be space. That would be, if you like, emptiness within which everything's happening. But that's just like too much. Even to glimpse it for a moment is good, because it's again cutting the route. But we quickly shy off it. And almost we think, well, I couldn't think anything if I was in that. If there was that much space, I wouldn't be anything. I couldn't think anything. But it isn't true, because we're thinking things in that space all the time. No problem. But we tend to think, oh, as soon as I think something, it's closed down. Well, actually, it didn't. It's another thought that it could close down. Yeah. So it's just a matter of keep coming back and noticing that's what you're experiencing, that's what's happening. And then be prepared to work with that for a long time. Yeah, and so once you've actually turned the space into something, there seems to be a self that's looking at it. And of course, it's now turned into a skanda. You've turned the space into a skanda. It's something constructed. So it's not the self, is it, anymore? But yeah, just keep looking, because that's what you'll experience. If you keep looking, you'll notice this keep happening. Gradually relax and become more confident and open out into it. So is there a danger of over-analysing the self and forgetting practice? Yes, there is. So don't get too analytical and too theoretical and too into your heads about it all. When you find yourself in your head too much and you sort of find yourself sort of battling away in your head, just notice, this is the skandhas. This is the skandhas of habitual tendencies of grasping. I'm not going to go in that direction. Just kind of relax and kind of unwind a bit, and then when you're more relaxed, you'll notice sometimes just one or two questions help you to, or they just arise as you're looking at your experience. You're looking at your experience and you're wondering about something, and then some of the teachings comes back. Maybe one, two phrases come back and start to intrigue you, and then you can feel that it's a living experience. It's not just theoretic in your up in your head and caught up in your thinking. You have to get the right feel for that. When is it reflecting that's leading to awakening, and when is it just thinking that's getting you in knots? And you can feel the difference, and as you go along the path, you get to experience what kind of reflection opens things up, what kind of thinking just ties you in knots and doesn't help, and then you learn to play with that. And then this question, what happens to self in non-duality? Well, it's not a term I often use, I don't think, non-duality. So, of course, if you're talking about that not divided into, not that skanda of consciousness, the skanda of consciousness is made up of this idea that moment by moment, there's a different object with a different moment of consciousness, because it's in time, and each moment you're aware of something. It might be the same thing again, but it's another moment. It's a fresh moment every moment. So you've got this idea of time, and it goes on in moments, and then those moments make up the mind as a stream somehow. So that's all constructed. That is the skanda of consciousness. It is based on this assumption that there's a division between the moment of, there's some sort of momentary stream of awareness of objects, which are momentary as well. And you don't need to think this is a philosophical idea. You just need to look at the way you think. I think, so I'm thinking, I'm looking for the moment now. And then I think, okay, the past moment's gone. Yeah, check it out, it's all gone, because it's past. And then the future moment, yeah, that hasn't come, that's going to come, it hasn't come, I can't know it because it hasn't come. So there's only this moment, this moment. So you're trying to be very aware of this moment, only this moment. Bring your attention to this moment. Oh, but it's just, that was the moment that was gone. I can't be being aware of that because it's gone. And then you can't do it, actually. But you need to do that exercise again and again and again and again to really convince yourself that you can't do it. That can't be how it is. But you've got to convince yourself. And then you hear people say, people who haven't looked that hard will say, oh, you just stay with the moment, stay with the moment. It's just such a nihilistic view. If you only stay with the moment, you're rejecting all the past and you're rejecting all the future. You're useless. I mean, what sort of person are you? Who's got no past and no future and can't do anything? I mean, it's just clinging to the skandhas, actually. You're just grasping at the skandhas. If you're really going to be in the nowness of the completeness and the wholeness of everything, the spontaneous, what Trungpa Rinpoche calls the panoramic awareness, it can't be momentary. It just doesn't work. So, the power of now is very mysterious. Very mysterious. Which question was I answering? Oh, addressing. Oh, yeah. No, where was I? Oh, no, what happens if the self in non-duality? So again, would you call that knowing where you're not making a division like that, would you call that, what would you, how would you describe that experience of that? And maybe you wouldn't use self for it at all. Just have to kind of go there and see. You might use self. You might say, anything that's not that it can't be what I am, because it doesn't make any sense. So I must be the awareness that isn't divided. And therefore I can't really say it's myself as opposed to anything else. So you might decide not to use self at all at that point. But what you've discovered in yourself is this non-dual awareness. So you might be using the word, or you might not be using the word. Because it's certainly not anywhere else, is it? Or you don't have any other kind of self. It has to be only that. But then it doesn't have any, there isn't any, and yet Buddhas are quite distinct, aren't they? You get Buddha Shakyamuni, Buddha Amitabha, the Buddha Ratnasambhava. You've got all these different Buddhas, and yet they're not in any way. You can't separate them out from anything else. This is again coming back to the separate but distinct. I mean, it's a very, very deep level of understanding when you get to that point. But I think it's good to know in advance that if everything's become an amorphous blob, or you're aiming for something that's an amorphous blob, you constructed something. You constructed an amorphous blob, and now you're aiming for it. But if I don't think about anything else except this amorphous blob, then I'm not thinking. So here you are. It's still the skandhas. Okay, Jessica's group. So that's a long question. You won't have the answer to that very quickly. There was a discussion about the true self, in brackets, and how this relates to Buddha nature, and are they referring to the same experience, or I should say the same reality? I would say they're talking to the same reality, aren't they? What is your Buddha nature? It's what you truly are in yourself. What each of us is in ourself, what we are. So I think we would use the word self, but I would avoid trying to say it is the self. I would say that at the beginning, to avoid at all costs saying anything is the self, and avoid at all costs that there is no self. The Buddha never said either of those, and I would advise anybody not to use those kind of statements, because they're going to go wrong. If you try to say this is the self or that's the self, it's going to go wrong. And if you say there's no self, that's going to go wrong. So don't say either of those things. Why would you say either of those things? Even though you can use the word self. It's really interesting, isn't it? But we don't need to say that there is a self or there is no self. if it's a good word to use to describe what your experience, then use it. But don't say there is one, because then you've made it into something, haven't you? Even to say there isn't one, you've turned it into something. But nonetheless, you can use it to point to something. I can point to, when I'm talking about myself, I'm using it to point to something. But I'm not saying I have a self, because then I've made me and myself, and I've made all sorts of things, and I've made all sorts of problems for myself. So it's interesting, isn't it? In the group, people's experience of self related to a sense in the heart that we know is always there, yet we only actually experience this when we notice it or something touches it, as these teachings have done. It feels like a quality that arises spontaneously and includes a sense of inner connection. As a consequence, we can then feel connected to others, and the group wondered how this is possible. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? We also discussed how this related to teachings on compassion and apramanas. So yes, it is very mysterious. It can't be analysed. Because when you analyse it, it splits up. So if you try to analyse what is, when I say my whole heart, and then I try to understand that by analysing it, I would get nowhere, would I? I probably wouldn't even try. Like when I say to people that when somebody's died, but they're still in your heart, and everybody goes quiet. They don't analyse. Touch is something very deep and intuitive, which is not skandhas actually. So you couldn't analyse it. You couldn't break it down into parts or bits or say what it was, because it's real. So the biggest questions for the scientific community are about what's real, and what's real can't be analysed. So what are they going to do? Or what are we going to do? How are we going to make that connection and use science to point to something that's real, that can't be analysed, can't be measured, can't be broken up into parts or broken up in any way, and is known all of a piece, and with all of a piece with the whole of reality? So yes, I think it's wonderful just how intuitive we are, that even though we're so deluded, nonetheless we can be touched, and we haven't completely lost connection with ourselves. I mean, how could we really? So yeah, I think that's really wonderful. And it's not that heart, okay, we experience that for a moment and then we grasp it, or we grasp something else, or we go off it. But it isn't that it arose. It was always there. It's just we kind of get caught up in the skandhas and we're ignoring it. But it never went anywhere, never does go anywhere. And when we drop our connection, when we drop the grasping at the skandhas, we don't need to then create the qualities of the heart. I mean, okay, we're full of hatred and anger, clinging to our body, clinging to our thoughts, our opinions, clinging to all and everything, and then something changes us, and we stop grasping in that way, even a little bit. Then the qualities of love and compassion and openness and friendliness and ease, we don't need to create them separately. They don't need to be created. As we drop the grasping, the opposite of grasping is all these qualities, which is quite wonderful, isn't it? It's quite wonderful. Nothing to remove, nothing to add. Yeah. So how do we know others have the same self, Buddha nature as ourselves? And how do we know there are others, even? I mean, how do I know you're not just the play of my own inner thoughts that I've projected outwards? Well, there's something to consider. Yeah. I think it's our wisdom, our intuitive wisdom, that recognizes, really deeply realizes, that it's insanity. Any other way is insanity. It's not going anywhere. So we don't really analyze that, do we? Are other people the same or different from myself? We don't analyze that. We just take that as a given. That they're the same, but they're distinct. We take it as a given. I don't know if it's. I can't think offhand. I can't think of any discussion in the Buddhist scriptures about that, whether it's ever questioned. But yeah, it's a really interesting question because it's a very deep intuition. So go back and look at it again and again. Is it something about the self or Buddha nature that is naturally connecting when all the not self stuff is out of the way and we are then linking into the non-separateness of reality itself? Yes, that's right. That's what I've been saying. The group expressed a sense of relief and reassurance from hearing these teachings about self, which is interesting. Maybe that links to what one of the other groups was saying, how there's this tendency to want to get rid of yourself. Like I'm horrible and I'm this nasty ego character who gets in the way of everything and spoils everything, and I want to get rid of them. And that the teaching on not self, I think I really bought into that. I thought, oh, that's good. I can get rid of that feeling of this nasty self. I can get rid of that by seeing it doesn't exist somehow. So yeah, and in a way, there's some truth in that, isn't there? If you're letting go of grasping at the skandhas as self, you are freeing yourself from that self that you want to be freed from. So there is some truth in that, as long as you don't take it too far. So that's why, if you have taken it too far, it's a relief to realise, oh, I've taken it too far. What I'm really trying to discover is what I truly am. I'm not just trying to show I'm not this horrible person, or I'm not this horrible thing, or, I'm trying to discover what I truly am, and that's something, as Dashi was saying this morning, that is the non-compounded, the non-contrived, the non-born, all the Buddha qualities, all of a piece, all of an instant, all kind of, wow, yes, let's get on with it. The teachings also generated a sense of aliveness and energy, with a greater willingness to open out and explore further. Good. This morning, Lama spoke briefly about the mandala of self and our need to guard this, and she also talked about the mandala of not self. So some further explanations of these two mandalas and how they interreact, would be much appreciated. Well, I think Dashi went into that this morning, didn't he? I thought that was good. So when you grasp the mandala of Mara's mandala, or your ego mandala, or whatever you want to call it, you lose sight. So you solidify that and you sort of lose sight of the spaciousness of our true nature. And then when you actually open out into your true nature, you lose, that sort of becomes, true produces is solidified in the sense that it's actually, that's our world. And then grasping at the skandhas just sort of evaporates into spaciousness. Yeah, it's kind of not a very interesting exercise. You could do it or not, but if you have the choice, you tend not to. So, Agnes's group. Oh, I've got time. I might have time to finish all the group's questions. I think you said this morning something like, as the skandhas are non-self, there doesn't seem to be a necessity for the second step to declare them, or all dharmas, as empty, because by being non-self they are false and illusory anyway. Did you say something like that? I think it was in connection with the shepherd boy, or am I mistaken? Yes, I said something like that. I'm curious about this. I've always found the expression the not self of the Dharma is a bit weird, because who thinks the Dharmas have a self? I mean, do you mean they don't have a nature? Well, of course they have some sort of nature, otherwise you wouldn't be talking about them. Or they don't have a self-nature. Well, who talks about self-natures of things? I don't talk about the self-nature of things. So I've always found it a very funny turn of phrase. I think I know what it's talking about, and I wouldn't use that turn of phrase for what I think they're talking about. But then when I look at, how not self, that's if you've said there's no self, then you've got to say there's also no self of the, so what's left is the dharmas, and then the Abhidharma says, we're not nihilists because we believe in the dharmas. And then in the Mahayana it comes in and says, yeah, the dharmas are not there either. You can't say there's dharmas and that saves you from nihilism, because the dharmas are also construction. I mean, they are, and what I said this morning in my talk, I was saying, well, actually, the dharmas are the skandhas. So we've already dealt with them when we've said they're not the self. So I think the reason they have to talk about the not self of the person and the not self of the dharmas separately is because it became so established, this idea that the Buddha taught that there is no self. And because once that became established, you had to teach, well, then he didn't teach it, he wasn't nihilistic, he taught that the dharmas existed. And then you've gone even further, you've gone even, I mean, in a way, that's like the first wrong view. You've now said the self is the skandhas, which the Buddha expressly said, the self is not the skandhas. But once the tradition has started using language in that way, then a way to kind of deal with that is to deal with it in two stages. Well, first of all, you're clinging to the idea of a self is false, and then your idea of clinging to the skandhas is false, and the dharmas is false. So let go of all your clinging, and now we can look at what their true nature is, which is what they do in the Mahamudra. So I don't think it's necessary to do it in those two stages. And in the Mahamudra text, they tend to not use it in two stages. They tend to just go straight for noticing that the nature of mind, and they just talk about that from the very beginning, which, and the Mahamudra tradition isn't alone in that, because the forest monk tradition in the Thai forest monk tradition, they also do that. You look at the nature of chitta, and then from there you get to see the true nature of, well, I don't think they use self so much. Don't have to use the word self, but it is a very natural way of talking, isn't it? That's what's most important, as the Buddha said. He would always ask people, is this the way you use the word? Yes. And isn't this true about it? Yes. Okay, I'll use the word that you're using. And I think we need to do the same. Are you using self for that? Yes. Okay, so let's use that word and see what, how it unpacks. So I'm hurrying now because I want to do justice to all these questions. So Luke's group said, how does the positive or healthy aspect of identity sit with the ever-repeated caveat of not identifying with feelings, emotions, and so on? And then I think the punctuation maybe is self, in the positive sense, true identity. Now, many Buddhist writers and translators like to translate self as identity, and I never know what they think they're doing. To the point that I go and look in the dictionary, what does identity mean? And it can mean various things. It can mean various things. It is not a translation of self. I mean, there's some overlap, but so I think I understand the question, though, because we talk about, I don't know if I do, but it's often people talk in terms of, when the feelings and the thoughts and emotions come up, rather than getting caught up in them, which I guess might be what is meant here by identifying with them. You notice that they are thinking, or that they're the skandhas, and that they're grasping, and then relax the grasping, and you might call that not identifying with them, mightn't you? In natural use of the word in English. You don't identify with them, you don't grasp them, and you don't think, this is me, I am that. So what's a healthy attitude? It would be to be, having noticed I'm not that, so what am I then? And then you begin to notice the qualities that are there that are not that, not the skandhas. And then, of course, this is where we get to the DHB. You notice that openness, you notice the clarity, you notice the sensitivity, you notice the heart wish, you notice that those heart qualities. You start to notice what you truly are, and what you want to be, what you always, and what, when you see others in that way, how connected you feel to others. So that all feels in the direction of freedom, doesn't it? Something's being liberated, something's being released, something's kind of, some sort of power and energy is coming out of that. So that's it, isn't it? So that's how they relate. I think that's answered that enough for now. So that was 9. I think we've just got one, which I'll do very quickly. So this is, I think there's just Andrew's group, and then there's the individual questions, which I won't get round to. So Andrew's group, points arising on what effect the teaching, I think it means the teaching on the self had on us experientially. I did wonder, I thought the groups would talk more about the experience of meditating on no self, because since all the books tell you that there's no self, then I would have expected people to have been practicing a long time, thinking they're trying to look to see there's no self, and that actually had a positive effect because they're still here. Been meditating on no self, and it had an effect. And I think it's worth looking at that to see whether that's a stage of the practice it's useful or not. But what effect the teaching on self had on us experientially, there was a general feeling of relief, a feeling of beginning to finally get it, a sense of opening up of what had felt was a confused area for several of us. And there's also a general sense of a need of clarifying the words that are used when talking about anything. Well, yes, especially internally, the words you use yourself. And much appreciation that ego was not mentioned until towards the end of the talk, and then only in relation to the ego mandala. Yes, I think it adds to the confusion no end to bring ego in and no ego in and non-ego in. I think that's an unnecessary level of confusion. Some points arose from the following discussions that led to the following questions. At one point you talked of the self of Dharma, or Dharma of self. No, I talked about the Buddha saying that identifying Dharma and self, rather like in the Praise to the Three Jewels, realized by the self alone, the Dharma, the true nature of reality that the Buddha realizes, which is the Buddha has taken refuge in the truth of the Dharma, that, which is a living reality rather than a particular Dharma. So I think that's. And is this referring to objects or sensations as in the Heart Sutra? No. Rather than the Dharma, the teachings. And it's not even the teachings, it's Dharma in the singular. Dharma, the sun of wisdom shining forth from the clouds of obscuration. The Dharma of the truth of cessation, actually, that is peace. Nishprapancha. That's the Dharma that's being referred to, and that's the Dharma the Buddha says is our refuge. And that's, it's realized by ourself. So we take refuge in the self that realizes the Dharma, which are not separate. You can't. The self is the Dharma is the self. Our refuge is the Dharma, the refuge is the self. I mean, he says that so explicitly that you can see how he's using language. And I think it helps if you don't put an article in front of self. It's not a self, it's not the self, it's just using this word synonymously with Nishprapancha. there appears to be two kinds of self when we look at our experience: spontaneous self-arisen, for example, even noticeable in baby, and what is imported, all the thinking, behavior, sensations, etc. we pick up along the way. Is this a simple way of looking at self, non-self, or are we pointing up on our personalities or innate attributes and missing the essential Buddha nature of our true self? Are we picking up on our... I mean, it's very interesting, this whole idea of the attributes of a person. Because we do tend to think of a person as being their memories and their particular little quirks and the way that they are. You know, we love them because they're this and because they're that and the other. And then maybe they get Alzheimer's or something and they lose their faculties, they lose their memory. Are they still them? Do we still love them in the same way? And some people think you can't, and some people think, of course you can. And it's really interesting, isn't it? It's a really good way of meditating on what is a person and what is the self of the person that you love, that you care about. And it for me, it comes down to heart. You know, this is where Patty's book is really helpful and interesting in this one. It does come down to the heart. It's strange, I think, and I've not worked with people with Alzheimer's, to be honest, but I suspect, and also reading Patty's book, I suspect actually that heart quality gets more and more accessible. That's probably the only thing that you can get through to, really, is that the kind of innocence of the heart. Just knowing there's another person there that cares. I'm sure you don't lose that faculty of knowing there's another being there that cares and you care. And that touches our heart. And we feel connected to the person because we've actually been able to meet on that level of caring. So it's not about what we've built up as, like I've got my history, I've got my, things that I've done in my life that make me this, that, or the other in people's eyes. Actually, none of that matters. What really matters to me is if people care. If they admire me tremendously, but they don't really think of me as a person that needs caring for, it's not really interesting, is it? But if somebody might not know me from anybody else, but because they just care, because I'm a person or, a being, then I'm so grateful to that person and I feel that love for that person, regardless of their past or my past. Just that's enough. That's I can really intuit that, and when I think about that in terms of what Buddha nature is, it makes complete sense that should be the case. So I think it's really important not to build up an idea of ourselves and identify with our job or identify with our nationality or our race or our looks, if you identify with all of that, well, you're going to suffer, aren't you? That is suffering. And if you identify with the love that you're able to feel in your heart when it's given to you, that feeling of gratitude that just kind of overwhelms you, and being able to give that to somebody else and to see them receiving it, you'll always have that. We'll always have that, won't we? So maybe it's not the answer to the question, but it's worth looking at. Are the use of words absolute reality and relative reality that are sometimes used another way of expressing the difference between self and non-self? Depends who's speaking, to be honest. Sometimes it doesn't correspond at all. So I'll leave that for another day. There can be a feeling of desperate grasping onto some aspect of non-self, even though there has been an understanding of the teaching of non-self. It can be visceral. One's whole being rejects it. It rejects it. Have you any suggestions of getting around these defenses, obstacles, other than by just sitting in meditation, just touching that feeling a little, letting go, recovering, repeat next session? This links to one of the individual questions, which was about the body and trauma being locked in the body. Again, I wouldn't say your only method is to sit in meditation and just stick it out. In fact, that's likely not to be the best advice. But to gradually ease yourself into the meditation, but to find ways of you're engaging in remaining in the mandala of awakening and gaining confidence in that. Anything that actually helps you gain confidence in that. And then there are, it's a problem that seems to be surfacing more and more in the world these days, doesn't it? This sense that people are carrying trauma around with them. And whereas in a Buddhist society, they would be probably talking in terms of the kleshas, you're locked, it's your karma, it's your kleshas. I'm not saying it isn't your karma and your kleshas, but I am saying that there's actually all sorts of skillful means for helping us to let go of our grasping at the skandhas and seeing what our true nature is. And it could be all these different things that are emerging, like the internal family systems, and then ways of learning to communicate more effectively. There's the, NLP kind of things. They're all things which help you to look more carefully at what's going on in your own experience. So if you're looking at, trauma is obviously a very strong fear, aversion reaction that's gone right into the whole fabric of your mandala, your personal mandala. So, you can actually just get one-to-one help looking at that more carefully, getting to understand that, getting to sort of those parts of yourself you want to reject, getting help with you can see how that can be loosened up, so that you're not, because rejection, very strong rejection and fear, is really solidifying the skandhas and having set yourself apart from the skandhas, but at the same time identifying with them. So you still think that's you, but at the same time you've kind of split it up into bits, and that's all skandha. And yet there's also some wisdom in that. And I'm discovering all sorts of different kinds of approaches to these kind of problems that I think are very helpful, and probably more helpful than just sticking it out, getting tenser and tenser, sitting, trying to meditate, and then also building up an aversion to meditation, which can't be good. So short periods of meditation, plus finding ways that you can loosen up that kind of identification with the skandhas in whatever way you can. So I think it's very individual, and I've run out of time. Yeah. So thank you for all your questions. And the individual ones, I might find some time to answer some on Buddhism Connect. I won't promise it, because I've still got questions left from the last 2 retreats we did. So there's nothing I like more than a question, though.